ensemble dedicated to performing diverse repertoire. She is an alumni of Parkersburg High School, West Virginia Wesleyan College, and Marshall University. So if you can help me welcome Allison.
Thank you, Em. It's good to be back in my home state. And thank you to all of you for getting up early at 9 in the morning to talk about assessment when there's Brazilian music and guitars going on. So I really appreciate you coming out. Let's start by doing some singing, so if we can stand. You might know this one. All things shall perish from under the sky. Do you know this one? If you do, sing along. If not, listen and we'll get it the second time. All things shall perish from under the sky. Music alone shall live. Music alone shall live. Music alone shall live. Never to die. Good, now you've heard it once. Now everybody must try it. Here we go. All things shall perish from under the sky. Music alone shall live. Music alone shall live. Music alone shall live. Never to die. All right, now we're going to sing it in a round. Woohoo! If you were born between January and April, you are now Group 1. If you were born between May and August, you're Group 2. And September through December, Group 3. All right, here we go. So the words are, let's just do, music alone shall live, never to die. Music alone shall live, music alone shall live. Let's just do music alone shall live forever and ever and ever. That'll work too. All right, or just make up words, do-do-do. Group 1, here we go. Music alone shall live, never to die. Group 2. Music alone shall live, never to die. 3. Music alone shall live, never to die. Music alone shall live, never to die. Group 2. Music alone shall live, never to die. Group 3. Music alone shall live, never to die. Music alone shall live. Music alone shall live. Music alone shall live, never to die. All right, we're a little fresh. Let's change things up. Let's do it in groups. Group 1, all of you. Group 1. And group 2, let's do your back. Group 2. And group 3 in the front. And maybe we'll add Sharon in that as well. Group 3. All right, group 1, here we go. Music alone shall live, never to die. Music alone shall live, never to die. Music alone shall live, never to die. Music alone shall live. Let's try diversifying again. This time group 2, we're going to go by seniority. 3. If you have taught less than 5 years, and that includes students, you will be in group 1. If you have taught between 5 and 15 years, you're going to be group 2. And then those of you over 15 years of service, you are group 3. All right, here we go, group 1. Music alone shall live ever to die. Music alone shall live. 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 Group 1, your favorite state song, Take Me Home Country Roads, the newest edition. And then those of you who are West Virginia Hills fans, and then anybody who falls into the other two, West Virginia, My Home Sweet Home, or This Is My West Virginia in terms of your favorite song. And I will also add, as a Wesleyan graduate, if you think My Home Among the Hills should be added to the list of state songs, join Group 3 as well. All right, Group 1, Country Roads fans. Music alone shall live, never to die. Music alone shall live. Music alone shall live. Music alone shall live, never to die. Music alone shall live. Beautiful, thank you very much. Have a seat. So why do we do that? Because it's great to sing in the morning, because it wakes us up. But also to demonstrate for you one way to assess within a large ensemble, because that's one of our biggest challenges as choral directors, is that we have these large groups. How do you hear them individually without putting anybody on the spot? So one of the ways to do it is what I call the divide and conquer method, and that's just to hear, to split people up into groups, and you can use things like rows or sections, especially if the piece is newer. You might also do it by seniority. Let's hear the seniors, let's hear the freshmen, let's hear the sophomores, or anything else. If you just want to do a random survey, like, oh, well, what do we think about the evolving state song thing that's going on? So you can divide into different categories. And what's nice about that is then when you walk around, as I was walking around, you get to hear individual voices. And we have some really beautiful voices in here. It was really nice to hear all the different colors that I don't hear when I'm just standing up here. When I'm just standing up here, I hear a big wash of sound. But when I walk through, I can hear all the different timbres that are coming through. So I talk about assessment. Sometimes when we hear that word, there can be some strong feelings that arise when we talk about assessment. So I think it's important just to put up front that, like most things, there are benefits and there are downfalls to prioritizing assessment. And as we all know, some of the most important lessons that we teach, they're just not measurable, and that's a good thing. However, many of the lessons we teach are measurable, and that's what we're going to talk about today. The important thing is that we use the right tools in order to get accurate assessments. The push for data, as we know, because that's why you're here, I would assume, this morning at 9 a.m., it's a trend that's probably going to be with us for the next decade. And, you know, like most historical trends, it may very well swing the other direction, but not in the near future. I would say the next 5 to 10 years at least, we're going to be looking at even more data coming in. Excuse me. I started my teaching out in Kentucky, and those of you who are familiar with Kentucky, huge assessment state. And I have to tell you, when I first walked in, it was a little overwhelming when they were asking for all this data. And I just, at first was, you know, I want to sing, I want my students to sing, I don't know how to give you data. And so a lot of what we're doing today comes from my experience trying to navigate the waters over there and then sharing with you some ideas. A big part of it is just learning to speak the lingo, honestly. They have this language that they want, and once you learn to translate what we already do into the words that they're familiar with, then all of a sudden it clicks, and it's not nearly as painful as it first appears. By learning to speak the lingo, we improve the stature of music as an academic subject, so it's no longer, okay, let's talk about the real subjects, and then there's music. You become part of the conversation, an academic subject. It increases data-driven evidence of you as a teacher, which is becoming increasingly important, and it provides statistical support for your program. So today's goals. We're going to develop a working definition of assessment. We're going to match types of learning with appropriate assessment tools. That may be the most important thing. We'll learn to write measurable objectives using the lingo that they're looking for. We'll explore the relevance of rubrics for measuring performance. We'll look at a sample unit plan and discuss efficiency strategies. And then if there's time left over, we'll have some discussion, because I know for a fact every situation is different. And probably if I asked each teacher in here, you would tell me a different schedule that you have for teaching, and so we have to adjust. So, what would an assessment session be if we didn't start with an assessment? Woohoo! So, with a partner, find a partner, discuss your answers to the following questions. You have 2 minutes. What does it mean to assess? And how do we assess authentically in the choral classroom? And what would be an example of an inauthentic assessment? So find a partner, somebody close to you, and 2 minutes.
Come in that way. It's like when she's talking.
All right, I hear some great conversation going on. Let's come back together. And is there anyone who would like to share? What is assessment? What is assessment? Be brave.
Gathering knowledge to know whether they did it or not.
Gathering knowledge to know whether they get it or not. That's a great one. Anybody else? All right. How do we assess authentically in the choral classroom? What is this authentic? What are your thoughts on this? Or examples of inauthentic?
Are you assessing what? Are you assessing what you intended for them to learn, or are you assessing something that has nothing to do with what you're teaching?
Right. Can you give me an example of inauthentic?
If you have set it up that you're going to be teaching this lesson on a lot of rhythm, and you're assessing whether they keep a steady beat while you're doing that, then that's inauthentic.
If you have a student in your choir class that cannot sing for anything, but they try their hardest and they come in and they participate and they're really good, and you still pass that student even though they're not reaching what you set out for your goals to be, I think that would be
Well, that brings up a good question. Is assessment the same thing as grading? Are assessment and grading
No, it's not.
No, talk to me about that. How are they related?
They're related, because you can use the assessment as a grade, but you don't have to. You can just use the assessment to see what they know, to let you know what you need to teach, or how you need to approach it differently so they understand what it is you're trying to teach.
Absolutely, absolutely. Good for you. Any other thoughts?
An assessment is an evaluation of skills, skill levels, and maybe an inauthentic would be, let's say I have a choir that I want to teach balance and blend, and I have two guys and 1,000 sopranos. And that might be maybe a definition of inauthentic. I mean, how are you going to?
It's a definition of tough. That's Sometimes when we think of numbers, when we hear, states coming to assess or whatever, we think numbers. And a lot of times, the first thing we think is, oh, I need to give a test, because tests are so easy. They just give us numbers right away. And yet, what we do is not test worthy for written tests. I mean, I can't give you a test and determine whether you sing well. And so it's trying to figure out how to measure performance, because that's what we do. We do performance in the world class, right? So good thoughts. The working definition for us today, which is very similar to the one given, to evaluate, to diagnose, and provide feedback. Not necessarily to grade. And I like to think of assessment as very similar as if you go to see a medical doctor. When you go see a medical doctor, the doctor doesn't give you, B+, good job. If you go to the doctor, he gives you or she gives you specific feedback. Your cholesterol is high, but your blood pressure is good, or vice versa. And then you talk about specific ways to target those things that are going on in your body. And that's what we do as teachers. We target specifically what's going on in the singing, so that way we can help you to improve. And grading may or may not be related, because I agree, there's so many students that grading can be many different functions. So there are two main types of assessment. You've probably heard these words before. Yeah? Formative and summative. Formative is the informal type of assessment. It's what we do in rehearsal all the time. We sing, we listen, we adjust. We hear this vowel is too spread, and we signal for the lips to round a little bit. Or we hear, someone's out of tune, and maybe we go stay next to them, and we try to get them back on. So formative assessment is the informal thing. It evaluates progress during the learning progress. It informs the teacher, and I think somebody said this earlier, of who's getting it and who needs additional help. And it may or may not include data. Examples include observation, group discussion, or oral questioning. Summative assessment is what's done at the end, and it's where the data comes from. It measures the learning at the end of a treatment, so the end of a unit, or the end of a grading period, or the end of a semester. It provides specific data, usually reflected in a grade, but not necessarily. And it uses formally constructed tools to record data, which is what we're going to talk about today. Examples would be a unit test, which might apply to a humanities course, not necessarily to choir so much, a term paper, or a solo and ensemble rating. And to assess authentically, the assessment tool must match the type of learning. So there are three main types of learning that we do in the Coral Classroom. We have knowledge-based learning, and a way to assess your knowledge. So for example, the name of a composer of a piece. If I wanted to informally determine whether you knew the answer, I could just ask. And if I wanted to officially know each individual, I could give you a written test item on that one. Reasoning, so a topic of, can you analyze the form of the piece? That might be a reasoning type of target. I can figure out if you know the answer to that by just discussing it with you, and if I put it on the test, it would be open response. And then the most important one, the skills section. And the formative assessment we do, we already do this, is we observe, and we listen, and we fix, and we evaluate, and that's essentially what we do our entire rehearsal. And then the thing that I think we often lack is then the summative data, which you can get through a rubric. How many people in here use rubrics right now? Excellent. So let's start by identifying whether the following are knowledge, reasoning, or skill targets. First one, the student will sing section A of Shocholotza en do with rhythmic accuracy. Is that a knowledge, reasoning, or skill target? Skill, right, and how do you know? Absolutely, and the dead giveaway is always the verb. What's the verb? Sing, and singing is definitely a performance type of activity. So if we wanted to assess whether they were able to do that, how would we do it formatively?
Formatively, you would listen, you would evaluate whether they have the correct rhythmic accuracy. If they don't, you can give them suggestions based off your observations.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's so obvious that sometimes we just, we don't even realize that we're doing all these things. And then summatively, we would use a rubric. Oops. What's the second one? The answer's right there. Knowledge, right. And look at the verb. The verbs that Deb gave away, they will identify. There's a right, a wrong answer. It's very clear. The student will identify the composer and country of origin for Shocholotza. Anybody know that song? It's a good one. And the last one, well, wait. So knowledge, formatively, if we wanted to assess, I would just ask somebody. Summatively, if I wanted to know whether every individual knew the answer, I might give them like an exit slip or something and just have them, answer a test question. Last one, the student will compare and contrast the form of Shocholotza with that of Suna will be done. And through process of elimination, we know that that is reasoning. And if we were going to assess, we would discuss as a large group. And summatively, I would have them write open response questions, so just writing out a few sentences, a short essay. So now, using the lingo, how to write measurable objectives in 3 easy steps. A big part of assessment is just starting with the actual learning target itself. So here's how we do it in 3 easy steps. First, most important thing, I can't tell you how many professional development sessions I went to in Kentucky where we talked about verbs for hours and hours and hours. Verbs are a huge part of the lingo. So start with an appropriate active verb. I've given you some that come directly from the Common Core. They love these verbs. They even made up songs, that we sang songs about these verbs. And so if you can start by using those, you'll be well on your way to being understood at the administrative level. Some knowledge verbs, identify, describe, list, select. Some reasoning verbs, analyze, compare, contrast. And then the most important category, skill verbs, sing, perform, demonstrate, use, and model. And then you need to explain what specifically, so identify the composer, compare, contrast the form, sing section A. And then if you're really going to be a winner and make your administrator very happy, you include the assessment as well. So for a knowledge chart, identify the composer and country on a written exam, or compare and contrast the form on an open response essay, or sing section A at a proficient level on a rhythm and rubric. Time for another assessment. Your turn. We're going to practice. So you have 2 minutes, and I want you to think about the repertoire that you're doing this semester for this upcoming spring concert. And it might have changed since you've had all these snow days I've heard about. But I want you to write a measurable knowledge in this form using this lingo, and it could be knowledge, reasoning, or skill. And see if you can follow the formula, an action verb plus what specifically, plus how. And you have 2 minutes. The verbs are on your handout if you need a refresher. So try to write one measurable learning target. 2 minutes, go. All right, did anybody come up with a good one? I know it's not always fun. I think that's the other part about assessment. You just have to kind of do it and just kind of make the, I don't know, the higher ups happy. You just have to kind of do it.
I'll go to the next picture. I teach band actually, but the section that we're working on in our spring repertoire is actually all the instrumentals, most instrumentals have to sing about 10 bars. It's a piece called Paradiso. So what I came up with was the instrumentals will sing measures, whatever, 24 through, etc., with accurate pitch and tempo.
All right, so the instrumentalists will sing measures 1 through 10. So they will sing skill, target, measures 1 through 10, that's what. And then you're going to measure tone quality. Yes. And how are you going to measure those things?
How are we going to measure this? Well, we can tell if they're using the correct pitches.
And there's a spectrum for sure in terms of great job to, well, we really need to work on that.
Okay.
So how do you...
We use a rubric to assess
Right.
that.
Right, and then we're going to talk about that in a second. Good. Anybody else? Want to share? Thank you.
I'm general music, and so I kind of adapted for a recorder like assessment. I said play the notes B, A, and G on your recorder with correct fingering, best support and posture, in accordance with my rubric. Was that rubric?
Great. Yeah. Anybody else? See, not so bad.
I have a song, I straight up Beyonce. I said, identify verse versus refrain by telling me the measure number.
Great, so they will identify what kind of target is that? Knowledge, yep.
And
And
then,
I had a couple others. Then it's to speak the lyrics in rhythm. And
good, is that speak the lyrics in rhythm? What kind is that? Skill, right? Mhm.
And then to sing their part on the refrain. It's a three-part. That's one, So that would be knowledge.
Read the third one again.
To sing the refrain on their part, either part 1, 2, or 3.
And what is the verb there?
Sing.
Sing. So what would that make that? Skill, right? Because you're measuring whether they can actually sing. Even though they have to know, in order to be able to do that, the singing itself will actually be.
Now, if they had to do that and they had other people singing with them, then it would be harmonic independence instead. Which
Right.
is also a skill.
Right, absolutely. And I've given you the white sheet that you have for your handout with some sample rubrics on it, and harmonic independence is one of the categories on there because you're right, it's very important. But we'll get there. All right, so what types of learning can we measure in the choral classroom? We've already mentioned some of them, singing. What are the knowledge reasoning things we teach, generally speaking?
Oh, form.
Form, okay, so that belongs to the broader category of music theory. So music theory is one, and what's the other big one that we, music history, exactly. And then in terms of skills, the ones that we, for whatever reason, sometimes don't realize that we're teaching, that we can measure quantitatively. What are some skills that we teach in the choral classroom? Singing, vocal technique, sight reading, listening. Yeah, oral skills, absolutely. Yeah. Right, so back to the ear, which we take for granted, but we do teach that. They come in at one level and they leave at another, ideally. So all these things that we teach that we sometimes forget, but tonal accuracy, hearing things within a key, that is a skill. Not everybody can do that. You probably have experienced some students who cannot do that, at least at first. That is a skill that you teach. Rhythmic accuracy, being able to feel a steady beat, being able to read rhythm, being able to perform rhythm, being able to make rhythm amongst other rhythms, that is a skill that you teach. Harmonic independence, that we were talking about over here. Vocal technique, these are all measurable things. Sight reading skills, and even musicality expression. These are things that we teach that we can measure. And the conclusion, of course, is that we are a largely performance-based class. And so if we are trying to gather assessment by giving written papers and written tests because that's just easier data to work with, that's inauthentic because what we do largely is performance-based. And that means that we need to learn how to work with rubrics. So, how do I make an effective rubric? I think the most important thing to know is, like I was saying before, each context is different. How many kids you have in your class, what their backgrounds are, what they bring to the table. And so I don't think there's a right answer in terms of rubrics for everybody. They have to be modified to your group and to your context. And they need to be age appropriate. What I would measure for vocal technique with my students at Eastman, who are 18, 19, is very different than what I would expect of my middle schoolers, who are 12 and 13. Very different times in life, very different expectations. And they should address all levels of ability and leave room for growth. So figure out, based on your group, what the ideal student in your group would have, and that'll be, 4, that'll be the top rating. Figure out where your bottom student is, make sure to put them there on a 1, and then you can make a spectrum in between. But there's no reason to put things on your rubric that they're never going to achieve. If you put, they're going to sing like Pavarotti, who's gonna really be able to do that in middle school? It's just, so you have to adjust it to what your group is and leave room for growth. I like to do a 4-point scale, but that's just because that's what Kentucky used, and so I just kind of used what they already had. And they use distinguished, proficient, apprentice, and novice. Are these words that you use here as well? And proficient should really be what you expect everybody in the classroom to end with, proficient. And then 4 is
maybe for a few that you want to push, maybe a few gifted students. But 3 is really where you want everybody to kind of cross the threshold. And there's 2 types of rubrics, and we'll talk about those: additive and hierarchical. And a little bit of motivation. You can do it. So let's look at a rubric for your earlier task of writing a measurable objective. On the left, we have an additive rubric, and that means that it's just a checklist. And for each one that you do, you get a point. And so there are 4 points possible. If you get all 4, you're distinguished. Good job. If you get 3, you're proficient. 2, you're apprentice. 1, you're novice. And if you did not write an objective, then you get a 0. Because yes, sometimes you need zeros. So let's grade take your objective out, and let's grade and see how you did. Did you use an action verb in your learning target? If you did, you get a point. Did you explain what specifically? If you did, you got a 2. Did you define how learning would be assessed? If you did, you get a 3. And if your type of assessment matched the type of learning target, then you get a 4, and there you go. So there is your rating for how you did. I could do the same thing with a hierarchical rubric, and that would be just what you see. It's kind of like a solo and ensemble rating. A 4 would be you wrote a clear learning target with 3 components where the assessment matched the learning target type. A 3 would be you wrote a reasonably clear target with 3 components where the assessment matched the learning type. And the way to determine that would be to give your objective to a neighbor and ask them, because they would be able to tell you, yes, that was clear, or no, that wasn't. And then you can read on down. So let's look at a sample unit plan. This comes from my middle school in Kentucky. And this will be a 6-week plan, 7th and 8th grade middle school choir. And for this particular unit, I had 4 broad categories that I was assessing. Did we do more than that? Absolutely. But these were the 4 categories that I actually gathered data on.